You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the 505th episode of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. With the last episode, we continued to set the stage for the Atlanta campaign by sharing some biographical info about William Tecumseh Sherman. And to do that, we hit the pause button as he was setting out on the Meridian Raid in Mississippi, the first week of February, 1864.
But now we'll hit the play button again, and what we see is that, naturally, when Sherman set out from Vicksburg, marching eastward into the interior of the state of Mississippi, it set off alarm bells on the Confederate side. Commanding the rebel forces in Mississippi, Alabama, and East Louisiana was the Bishop General, Leonidas Polk. And we call him the Bishop General because in 1827, upon graduation from West Point, where he'd been a friend of Jefferson Davis, rather than taking up his officer's commission in the U.S. Army, Polk instead entered the Episcopal ministry and in time became a bishop. After the Civil War began in 1861, Jefferson Davis made Leonidas Polk a major general, based on nothing other than his high ecclesiastical status and the fact the two had been friends at West Point.
Leonidas Polk proved over and over that he was not a good general, but he was personally brave and was popular with the rank-and-file rebel soldiers. And most importantly, his friend, Jefferson Davis, was never going to sack him. So after Chickamauga, when Braxton Bragg demanded that Polk be court-martialed for insubordination, Davis instead transferred the Bishop General out to Joe Johnston's Army of Mississippi.
That meant Polk inherited command of the Army of Mississippi when Joe Johnston packed his bags and took himself off to Dalton, Georgia, after being assigned to command the Army of Tennessee. In any case, when Sherman set out from Vicksburg, marching east into the interior of the state of Mississippi, Polk at first was uncertain what Sherman's exact objective might be, but he decided Sherman must be headed for Mobile, Alabama, the major blockade-running port down on the Gulf Coast that was still in Confederate hands.
However, when Sherman didn't take the turnoff, so to speak, for Mobile, Polk realized that he must instead be headed for Meridian. And so Polk had everyone work around the clock, removing everything of value from the warehouses and stockpiles at Meridian, which was accomplished literally minutes before the Yankees arrived.
In the meantime, Polk had been telegraphing Joe Johnston in Georgia and pleading for reinforcements, but Johnston had said he couldn't send any. However, Jefferson Davis in Richmond had been monitoring the situation, and besides the fact Polk was a friend and Johnston was an enemy, well, Davis didn't think it was a good idea to let Sherman parade through Mississippi and possibly Alabama against nothing more than token Confederate resistance. So on February 17th, Davis ordered Joe Johnston to send 3 divisions from Georgia from Hardee's Corps to reinforce Polk ASAP.
Davis hoped that reinforcing Polk with those 3 divisions, Cheatham's, Cleburne's, and Walker's, would allow Polk to destroy Sherman. Joe Johnston wasn't happy about the order to detach those troops and send them to Mississippi, but he obeyed. And so on February 18th, he instructed Hardee to hustle out to Mississippi and report to Polk. And the 3 designated divisions of his corps would follow as soon as they could be loaded aboard trains at Dalton and started west.
Cheatham's division was the first to depart Georgia, headed for Mississippi, on February 20th. 2 days later, Cleburne's division began boarding trains, and Walker's division was to follow. That meant that soon enough, Polk would be reinforced by about 16,000 of the Army of Tennessee's finest troops.
However, as part of the Federals' plan for the Meridian Raid, Ulysses S. Grant had promised Sherman he'd threaten Joe Johnston at Dalton to prevent any Confederate troops from being sent from Georgia to Mississippi. So what had happened?
Well, remember we said that Grant was worried about James Longstreet and the threat he believed Old Pete still posed even after his failed assault on Knoxville. Well, Longstreet actually wasn't a threat, but here Grant had received some more bad intelligence regarding Longstreet, saying Old Pete had received reinforcements from Virginia and was going to attack Knoxville again. Only after Grant got this sorted out and realized it was a false alarm did he direct George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, to conduct a, quote, reconnaissance in force against Dalton.
But earlier, because of the Longstreet scare, Grant had ordered Thomas to send 14,000 men from the Army of the Cumberland to Knoxville. So between recalling those troops and a period of heavy rain that complicated matters, it took Thomas more than a week to get the reconnaissance in force against Dalton underway.
In addition, Thomas was ill, so it was his senior corps commander, Major General John Palmer, who on February 22nd finally set out from the Chattanooga area, leading 25,000 soldiers from the Army of the Cumberland headed for Dalton.
The Federals' reconnaissance in force that finally set out from the Chattanooga area, headed toward Dalton, was a matter of shutting the barn door after the horse had already got out, since the Confederates were already in the process of sending reinforcements from Georgia to Mississippi. But in the end, it hardly mattered, since by then Sherman was marching back to Vicksburg, and Jefferson Davis's hopes of catching and destroying him came to naught.
We'll remind you again that we covered the Meridian Raid in some detail back in episodes 456, 57, and 58. So here, all we'll say is that after marching across Mississippi, Sherman had spent 5 days around Meridian, wrecking the place and destroying over 100 miles of railroad tracks to the north, south, east, and west. The Federal soldiers had also fanned out across the countryside, plundering farms, plantations, and villages, burning cotton and corn, killing and eating poultry and livestock, and torching houses, shops, and farm buildings. They also took thousands of slaves, or rather the slaves escaped and went with them, since Sherman himself had little interest in freeing slaves or incorporating black soldiers into the Army of the Tennessee for that matter. The only interest he had in emancipation was as a means to punish the Southern planter class that he believed had spearheaded the push to secession.
While Sherman marched back to Vicksburg, the big reconnaissance in force in North Georgia headed back toward Chattanooga. George Thomas supervised this part of the operation, since Grant had insisted he rouse himself and take the field. At any rate, the Yankees had spent 3 days, February 24th through 26th, skirmishing with the Confederates who were posted along Rocky Face Ridge, an almost solid range of steep, rugged hills to the north, west, and south of Dalton.
In the process of skirmishing with the rebels holding Rocky Face Ridge, the Federals learned two things. One was that the ridge, when approached from the north, in particular Buzzard Roost Gap, through which the railroad runs, is virtually impregnable. The 10th Michigan found this out the hard way when they lost 60 men in a matter of minutes while probing the rebel defenses.
The second thing the Yankees discovered is that the Confederates were vulnerable to a flanking move.
On the afternoon of February 25th, Colonel Thomas Harrison's 39th Indiana Mounted Infantry, having been ordered by Palmer to explore the southern approaches to Rocky Face, entered Dug Gap, a pass 5 miles to the south of Buzzard's Roost Gap. The Hoosiers drove away the enemy infantry company stationed there, then repulsed an attack by some Confederate cavalry.
Harrison reported that while his single regiment didn't dare go any farther, a stronger force could have easily pushed on to the east and reached the Western and Atlantic Railroad south of Dalton and cut it, thereby severing Joe Johnston's line of communication and supply back to Atlanta.
Harrison didn't retreat from Dug Gap until the next morning, when he was attacked by one of Cleburne's brigades, which had reached Alabama on its trip out to Mississippi, but had been hurriedly recalled when Joe Johnston sent frantic messages to Richmond claiming he'd been attacked by Grant's entire army.
On the Federal side, and most importantly for our story, George Thomas was impressed when he learned what Harrison had done and what might have been accomplished by a stronger Federal force.
Thomas knew that the rebels at Dug Gap couldn't be expected to be caught off guard a second time, but as he studied his maps and scouting reports, he realized there were other passes through the southern extension of Rocky Face which could also be penetrated. In particular, his attention focused on a pass about 12 miles south of Dalton. Its name was Snake Creek Gap, and it led to the village of Resaca, where the Western and Atlantic crossed the Oostenaula River. Then George Thomas, having taken note of Snake Creek Gap, filed this information away in his brain for possible future use.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
Sherman's Meridian raid in Mississippi and the reconnaissance in force in Georgia, which led George Thomas to take special notice of Snake Creek Gap, happened in February of 1864. Then, two other events took place in February that are also worthy of mention.
The first was Jefferson Davis's announcement that, quote, General Bragg is assigned to duty at the seat of government and, under the direction of the President, is charged with the conduct of military operations in the armies of the Confederacy.
This unexpected announcement took many Southerners by surprise, considering Bragg's dismal track record, both strategically speaking and also with regard to his inability to get along with many of his fellow officers.
However, there were a few people who welcomed the news of Braxton Bragg's new posting as, in effect, the Army's chief of staff. One of them was Joe Johnston, who telegraphed Bragg, I have had the pleasure to see the announcement of your position.
No doubt Johnston hoped that Bragg, as the Army of Tennessee's former commander, would provide Jefferson Davis with a better understanding of the Army's needs and challenges.
However, Johnston failed to take into account Bragg's intense resentment of some of the Army's top generals, such as Hardee, Cheatham, and Claiborne, all of whom tried to have him sacked even prior to the debacle at Missionary Ridge. And now Bragg's new posting in Richmond put him in a position to continue meddling in the internal affairs of the Army of Tennessee. With Bragg having the president's ear in Richmond, it was unlikely any general Bragg viewed unfavorably would receive promotion, no matter how capable he proved himself. The flip side of that coin was that any pro-Bragg general would likely be regarded favorably in Richmond, even if they performed less capably than their peers.
Even more to the point, Johnston also failed to take into account that since Jefferson Davis salvaged Bragg's career, Bragg owed everything he had now by way of military status to the Confederate president, and therefore Davis's enemies would be Bragg's enemies too. And near the top of Jefferson Davis's enemies list was Joe Johnston.
The other significant event that took place that month was neither unexpected nor controversial. On February 29th, Abraham Lincoln affixed his signature to a bill just passed by Congress resurrecting the grade of lieutenant general, to which Ulysses S. Grant was to be appointed and serve as general-in-chief of the Union armies. Arguably, that document was the most important Lincoln had signed since the Emancipation Proclamation, because where the proclamation had transformed the purpose of the war, Grant's elevation would change the way the war would be waged. With Grant as general-in-chief, for the first time the North's military might would be directed by a man capable of using it with maximum effectiveness in the pursuit of victory.
On March 2nd, a captain in the 18th Tennessee wrote a letter to a family member telling him, quote, "General Hood has taken command of a corps in our army. My division is in his corps. I have not seen him yet. I expect we will like him very much."
Upon arriving in Dalton, Joe Johnston had found the Army of Tennessee divided into 2 infantry corps and a cavalry corps. One of the infantry corps was commanded by Hardee, who, upon Johnston's arrival, stepped down from his temporary post as the head of the army. The other corps was commanded by Major General Thomas Hindman.
Hardee's corps had 4 divisions, while Hindman's consisted of 3 divisions. The 4-division cavalry corps was under Major General Joseph Wheeler.
From the time he took command, Johnston wanted to change this organization. He believed that the Army of Tennessee would be more flexible and easier to handle if the infantry were organized into 3 corps, like Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. So Johnston requested permission to make such a change and recommended that his longtime friend and protege, Major General W.H.C. Whiting, be sent to command the new 3rd Corps.
When he learned that the War Department in Richmond wouldn't entrust Whiting with such an important assignment, Johnston substituted the name of a Major General Mansfield Lovell and repeated his request to be sent a commander for a new 3rd Corps.
Like so many matters, that request to change the Army of Tennessee's organization widened the divide between Joe Johnston and Jefferson Davis. In requesting Whiting and then Lovell, Johnston, probably unknowingly, nominated 2 officers who had been identified by the Confederate president as political enemies. Eventually, the War Department denied Johnston's request to form a 3rd Infantry Corps because it said the Army was too small to justify such an organization. Well, to Johnston, it must have seemed that Jefferson Davis had once again chosen to slight him, while to Davis, it seemed that Johnston was seeking promotion for two of the president's political enemies.
In fact, Jefferson Davis had plans of his own regarding a new corps commander for the Army of Tennessee. You see, in the fall of 1863, long before Bragg resigned, he'd recommended that John Bell Hood be promoted to lieutenant general and assigned to command a corps in the Army of Tennessee.
At the time, Hood was in Richmond, recovering from the serious wound he'd received at Chickamauga that had cost him his right leg. Hood had already lost much of the use of his left arm after being wounded at Gettysburg, and it wasn't until late February 1864 that he was able to return to the field. When he reached Dalton, he took command of Hindman's corps, and Hindman reverted to command of his division. And Joe Johnston welcomed Hood's arrival, since Hood was widely and correctly regarded as a fighting general. Hindman, who resented not being given permanent command of the corps, submitted his resignation, but Jefferson Davis refused to accept it.
After his arrival at Dalton, Joe Johnston did a great deal to dramatically improve the condition of the Army of Tennessee, both in rebuilding morale and also setting the supply situation in order. But many of the old command problems that had bedeviled the Army for so long persisted, and Hood's arrival added yet another level of complexity to that messy state of affairs.
For various reasons, Joe Johnston and William Hardee never clicked, so to speak. So Johnston usually didn't consult much with Hardee, which irked William Hardee. After Hood arrived, Johnston pretty much ignored Hardee and turned to Hood as the subordinate upon whom he could most rely.
But, as we'll see, Hood, who had used his time convalescing in Richmond as an opportunity to cozy up to Jefferson Davis, would carry on a brisk, unofficial correspondence with the Confederate president and others, and his letters, more often than not, contained criticisms of Johnston and were filled with not-so-subtle hints that the Army of Tennessee would perform better if only it had a new commander.
In addition, Wheeler, the cavalry chief, had long been allied with the Army of Tennessee's pro-Bragg faction, and in fact owed his position almost exclusively to Bragg's patronage. It's not terribly surprising, then, that Wheeler, too, sent letters from Georgia that were highly critical of Johnston's management of affairs.
And so, along with Army Command, Joe Johnston inherited a command muddle. That condition could be traced to the toxic command environment that had festered under Bragg, and to Jefferson Davis's refusal to deal with the problem.
That messy state of affairs didn't get any better after Joe Johnston's arrival at Dalton, although the trouble didn't take the form of the open revolts that had so often flared up under Braxton Bragg. Instead, the conflicts now in the Army's high command were more subtle, but would prove just as harmful. The continued dysfunction within the Army's high command helped to poison relationships, and it increased the mistrust between Johnston and Jefferson Davis. It hampered cooperation between the Army's generals and opened the way for some officers, both within and without the Army of Tennessee, to intrigue against one another in pursuit of personal advancement, or to reward their friends and to punish their enemies. All in all, that sad state of affairs only added to the challenges faced by the Confederates in North Georgia in the spring of 1864. Once the Atlanta campaign kicked off, on the federal side, the trust between Grant and Sherman and between Grant and Lincoln meant that military operations wouldn't be impacted by the kind of dysfunction that existed on the Confederate side. And as it turned out, the Confederacy as a whole would pay a very high price for the divisions within the Army of Tennessee's high command that widened and worsened during the course of the Atlanta campaign.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Conflict and Controversy in the Confederate High Command, Davis, Johnston, Hood, and the Atlanta Campaign of 1864 by Dennis B. Conklin.
As always, you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon, just like Ann C. and Aaron O. did this past week. A big thank you to them for their support of the podcast. And then thanks also to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.